All right, welcome to our next lecture. This is a lecture on Book 3 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is, of course, for St. Vincent's basic class on Introductory to Ethics. And Book 3, again, like Book 2, it's sometimes difficult to completely isolate a key subject for the whole book. But I think that we can broadly construe the subject of Book 3 to be some basic concepts that have to do with moral responsibility and how that affects us keeping under control some of the irrational elements of our nature. As Aristotle progresses, and you will notice this, there is kind of a hierarchy of values in the Nicomachean Ethics. He's going to end up talking about what he considers to be the highest form of life, which is the contemplative life, actually. And not only the contemplative life, but the contemplative life joined with friends. And he arrives at some of those conclusions in very typical Aristotelian form, quite logically. But it stands to reason that we can't ascend to those higher values, those more complex virtues, like friendship and true contemplation, the true and rigorous use of reason, unless we first get some of our more base and irrational desires under control. Does that not make sense? So it makes sense that he wants to cover some basic concepts concerning moral responsibility and the basic control of some of those more animal or visceral desires, so that he can move on to some higher and more complex subjects. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and dive in. I've already written some things on the board, and I'll just go through them. And of course, this is mostly just for my class, but there's some other people here present that I'm trying to help, just to help through a reading of the Nicomachean Ethics. One of the first things that, the first set of concepts that Aristotle writes about or lectures about are the difference between voluntary and involuntary actions. So voluntary up here, involuntary, and somewhat with some difficulty, actions that are mixed. There is such a thing that is not an action that is not entirely voluntary or not entirely involuntary. It has a mixed nature. And this gets much more complicated than what I will explain, but the purpose of this lecture is, as I've told you before, to at least give you a kind of map to understand the whole, so that you can fill in some of the blanks yourself. But hopefully I can give you enough information that you can navigate through Book 3 and go, oh, okay, I basically understand what this means. That's my only purpose here. Involuntary actions, to summarize, are those actions done under constraint. If someone has a gun to your head and they're demanding that you perform a certain action, well, that you're compelled to do it. You're certainly frightened out of your mind. You have every reason to be. And so that would be an action that would be quite involuntary. Aristotle often or also defines acts done out of ignorance as involuntary. A good example would be, say you have a person who is mentally handicapped in some way, shape, or form. They can perform, they can even sometimes commit crimes. They can hurt other people, sometimes fairly badly, without knowing. They don't have a full understanding of what they are doing. And so many of those actions are, in fact, involuntary. There was a situation once at my last parish. I remember visiting the family, and I don't remember the particulars of the situation, but it was very, very sad. There was a fellow who came to do some kind of maybe electrical or plumbing work in the house, and for some reason he took this woman's oxygen tank. There was an elderly woman that was living there, and she required some oxygen, and it was in the way, and so he put it away in the garage or something like that without really knowing what he was doing. And at a fairly critical moment, this woman needed her oxygen and she could not find it, and she passed away. And the man was held responsible for this action. I think he went to prison, but it was not very long. It was something like a year, because he did not intentionally, of course, hurt that woman, but there were still some dire consequences for his actions, consequences that hurt people dramatically. So even, if he would have done that action voluntarily, our law recognizes the distinction between these two. He would have been given, 10 years to life for an action like that. If it was proved that it was voluntary, that it was done with full knowledge, and without constraint. You had the freedom to act, and you did it. So those are just some basic distinctions between voluntary and involuntary action, which we need to understand as we're discussing or thinking about ethical behavior. This distinction is very, very key to understanding the nature of culpability. I usually write that on the board. I don't have room right here, I don't think. Culpability, though, I think you can spell it yourself. Culpability is how blameworthy are we for a particular action. And this distinction between voluntary and involuntary and mixed actions kind of speak to how culpable is someone, how blameworthy or sometimes praiseworthy is an action that they have committed. Another good way to think about this, and I think that you can see what I did here. With involuntary, I have an arrow facing the word, and voluntary, I have an arrow facing away. There's a reason for that. Can you see that? I think you can. Because voluntary actions, Aristotle tells us that they come from within. There is an inner space of freedom when we consider voluntary actions. And with voluntary actions. And with involuntary actions, we are moved by something else. Something almost forces us, whether we could consider it a person, a situation, or even some form of ignorance. It's almost as if we're pushed in a certain direction to act in a certain way. So that's also a very good distinction to make with trying to understand whether or not we are culpable for our actions. At this point, I would like to, I have the word determinism written underneath. for a very, very particular reason. Determinism. Many of you may have heard this word. It's still a fairly common concept thrown around, probably more commonly in the scientific community. And the reason why I'd like to make this distinction or to talk about determinism is I believe that it's one of those things that we still encounter in our present culture that very much applies to the terms that Aristotle is trying to define in Book 3. There are still possibly more and more individuals that would believe that almost all, if not all, of our actions are in fact involuntary. Okay, and maybe that sounds odd to you, but this is actually quite a common mindset, particularly in the scientific community. I don't want to pick on scientists. Certainly all of them are not like this, but think about it this way. Determinism is really, it's almost self-explanatory that let's have a theoretical, come up with a theoretical number. Let's say that there are 1,000 factors that decide how we make a particular decision. That's all the factors there are, 1,000, okay? What a determinist will say is that if we know all 1,000 of those variables, we could predict with 100% accuracy how someone will act. We can determine it, okay? Hopefully that makes a little sense. But what Aristotle believes is certainly if we know those 1,000 factors, we could probably predict with, let's say, 96, 97% accuracy how someone will make a decision. He would, because that's logical. But Aristotle will still maintain that there is a mystery about the human person, that there is an inner freedom that no matter what, if those 1,000 factors say, hey, that person is going to take a right turn at this juncture, we still have the freedom to make a left-hand turn, according to Aristotle. Does that make some sense? I hope it does, because why would this be a scientific mindset would also be a very good question to logically pursue. And I think that that's also fairly simple to understand, or we can simplify it. Every concept I'm talking about is incredibly complex, and we could talk, you could write books, and there are books that exist on every single word on this board, right? But if all of the world is simply material, just atoms bombarding each other, pushing one another this way and that way and this way and that way, that if we knew all of the factors, all of the physical factors affecting those atoms, we would be able to predict with 100% accuracy what those atoms will do, how they will form, what they, how they will move. You see how that's a materialist, somewhat scientific mindset, but where much of the philosophical tradition, and certainly most of religious traditions, not just Christian tradition, is still going to say that even if we know all of that information, there is some mystery, some depth in the human being that could decide against where those variables are hitting us. We could choose another way. So I think that that's, and do you believe in determinism? That is a good question to ask yourself. Is there truly evidence for that? Aristotle does not believe in determinism, although I think he would say if we know a person's background and we know all the variables, we could predict with pretty decent accuracy what kind of choices someone will make. But haven't we heard stories about being completely surprised by what some human beings do? Some human beings perhaps getting the best of upbringings, having the best education, and end up going down a, let's just say, a very dark path, a very dark and difficult path. And we've seen examples of human beings that, despite perhaps coming from a very poor poor upbringing, possibly both education and materially speaking, have risen above their circumstances and made of themselves an incredible success that most of us would recognize as success. So I think that there's at least some circumstantial evidence that determinism, at least regarding morality, is false, and that there are such a thing as voluntary actions. Do you see why determinism would say that all of our actions are involuntary, because all there exists are external factors moving us places. Things from the outside pushing us here and there and everywhere. This would be the same group of people who would culturally say or that our actions are determined by the way we were raised, our race, our culture, our gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is a personal opinion, but I think one based on logic. Of course, those things determine some aspects of our moral behavior. Of course they do. I think it would be ridiculous to say that they did not. But do they completely determine it? I think that that's demonstrably false. But I think that that's a very important thing to bring up, because it's a viewpoint we can still look at YouTube videos and see, a scientist or sociologist talking about some of these things, and all of a sudden you'll hear them say something about how our behavior is completely determined, and you're like, aha, I learned that in ethics class. It's important to draw some parallels between what we see in this ancient text and what we still hear in the modern world. So mixed actions are exactly that. Those done out of fear of some evil or for some noble purpose. Say you're jettisoning, you're in a storm and you're on a ship. And of course, this was a much more common thing in the ancient world than it is today. And you push over all the cargo that belongs to someone else because you're trying to save the ship. Well, kind of technically, you've destroyed property. Not a very nice thing to do, but you're trying to save lives. So there's kind of a mix between voluntary and involuntary there. Or if someone, there are situations in the concentration camps, for example, where the soldiers, who were sometimes, well, not sometimes, most of the time, utterly brutal, would play little games with the inmates and say, look, you have to choose between which one of these two of your friends are going to die. And if you don't choose, we're going to kill these 20. I mean, that actually happened. And, someone making a choice, but it is a free choice. There is some voluntary action going on there, but we can see there's also terrible constraint. So somewhat mixed. So it's not always clear. And Aristotle is at pains and often tells us that in ethics, we can't expect everything to be decided with mathematical precision. That's unreasonable. That we need to, for each subject has its own special kind of accuracy and precision. Mathematics has a rather rigorous level of precision. Ethics, ethics is a good bit more iffy because its subject matter is the human heart, and we're pretty unpredictable creatures very often. So that's that. Moving on, I want to stop and talk about this one aspect of Aristotle's view of the soul. And I think that this will help us understand some of the virtues that he talks about, particularly towards the end of this chapter. So I'm kind of skipping around a little. That if you take into consideration, Aristotle considers that there's a rational part of the soul and there's an irrational part of the soul. In other words, there's a part of the soul that's governed by reason, our reason and our will, our ability to think and decide. But there's another part of our soul that really, our vegetative nature, our senses, they just sort of work kind of on their own. We don't really command them exactly. They just do their work almost independently of what we decide or what we think, okay? An irrational part of the soul. And the best situation, of course, is for the irrational part of the soul, particularly our more animal nature, our pursuit of pleasure and our flight from pain, or our embracing of pain if it's necessary. Those are more animal parts of our nature. And ideally, in the Aristotelian mindset, our irrational part will obey the rational part. And unfortunately, there's another part, and Aristotle maps this out in towards the latter end of book 1, if you want to take a look at his discussion of the soul. I put a little bubble to the side and put rogue, okay? A wanderer, a thief, okay? There's a part in our irrational nature that just sometimes doesn't obey reason. It's on the side. It's not in here where it should be. This is where the happy life is going to be for Aristotle. I mean, if you can imagine, and Aristotle's teacher, Plato, did come up with this particular image. If you can imagine that the rational part of our soul is like a horseman, a rider, and our irrational part is like a horse, okay? That ideally, the rider should control the horse. Now, I don't know if you've ever ridden horses. I had horses growing up, at least when I was a teenager. If the horse is in control, you are in trouble, okay? You're in a lot, and it's very frightening. That horse can run away with you. That horse is, in a certain sense, more powerful than you if you don't know how to control it. It's very key. So it's not a bad image for the cooperation or lack of cooperation between the rational and irrational part of the soul. If the horse is in control, Aristotle said that is a recipe for a fairly short and unhappy life. That's not what he's aiming at. So I think that in order to understand why Aristotle writes about two particular virtues before he moves on to the other ones. And particularly, I'm talking about courage and self-control. He spends a few chapters towards the end of book 3 talking about courage and self-control. Now, why would he do that? I want to sketch this out briefly and explain what is going on there. Could we pause there for a second, please? Okay. What does that kind of sketch of the soul have to do with particularly the virtues and vices that Aristotle speaks about or writes about in the latter portion of book 3? He's not simply picking out a couple of random virtues and saying, okay, let's just start here. Let's talk about courage. Let's talk about self-control, because later we're going to get a list of virtues. And sometimes it can be difficult to understand, is there a method to Aristotle's madness? There is. If you followed what I wrote really rather simply on the board concerning a kind of a rough sketch of the Aristotelian soul, do you remember when we discussed that a kind of index to virtuous behavior is our reaction to pleasure and pain? You remember that? Okay, that if we are habituated from a young age to feel pleasure and pain, because they are so basic to our nature, even our animal nature, even our rational nature responds to pain and pleasure regarding base and noble actions. That if we, according to Aristotle, if we feel pleasure at the appropriate actions and pain at the appropriate actions, we will be a virtuous person. If you actually enjoy treating people with kindness, conducting yourself politely in public, showing charity to others, all the things we would recognize as virtues, if you're habituated as a child and rewarded for those activities, well, that you'll, generally speaking, be virtuous. And if we feel pain with the appropriate vices, we act up, we're rude, we're destructive, cruel, and a good upbringing, parents are going to blame that. They're going to punish that in some extent, to some extent, and it should be. And Aristotle would very much agree with that. So what am I talking about here? Well, what is Aristotle talking about here? That's a better question. Who cares what I'm talking about? No one cares, okay? What I'm trying to give you is what Aristotle thinks. If pleasure and pain are so important to our behavior as virtuous human beings, then we need to have those virtues in place that most control our irrational nature, the part of our soul that responds to pleasure and pain. Self-control, for example, the reason why he talks about self-control is that self-control is the mean regarding pleasure. Okay, now think about what you've already learned. Remember, the virtue is found in the mean between extremes. Pleasure is a major subject. Okay, it must be controlled. So Aristotle goes through some pains, or at least, a chapter or so, speaking about the mean regarding pleasure and its opposite, which would be self-indulgence. The man or the woman who simply has no control over their pursuit of pleasures. Okay? Does that make some sense? We see this, unfortunately, we see this in ourselves, okay? When we don't have some control over the pursuit of pleasure, it usually ends in a fair amount of disaster. I mean, if say there's a pleasure, like just sitting and vegging out, watching Netflix, eating Doritos and M&Ms or whatever, ice cream, whatever our particular indulgence happens to be, okay? Over the short term, well, this might be quite good for us, quite pleasurable. It might help us relax. We all need that, okay? But when we do 10 years of that and we gain 70 pounds and it's hard for us to tie our shoes and we can't climb a flight of stairs or play with our kids without getting utterly tired out, well, there's a problem there. Is that a happy life? In other words, we might have to endure, we might have to have some courage, we might have to have some self-control regarding some temporary pain. This is where these two are related. Courage is the mean regarding pain, whereas self-control is the middle way, the mean regarding pleasure. And these are the virtues that we could say, I think, with some accuracy, most control that irrational part of our nature. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So there's a reason why Aristotle goes through some pains to talk about these virtues before moving on to what he considers the higher virtues. And this is a very, very important point, just generally speaking. Temperance. Aristotle is going to discuss the cardinal virtue of temperance. It's called cardinal. I think cardinal means like a hinge, a primary virtue. And temperance is very related to these, but we'll differentiate that later. Do you think for a moment that you can move on to true courage, temperance, the contemplative life, be capable of being an honorable and reliable friend, have those virtues of high-mindedness, nobility, all of the things that we consider truly excellent in a human being? Do you think that we will be able to arrive there if we don't first have these? Not going to happen, according to Aristotle. These are like the gateways. It's the foundation of the house that we're trying to build. It's like, look, so Aristotle's saying, look, if you don't have some virtue, some middle way to handle the pain that we have to endure in this life and the pleasure that we must control in this life, then you better stop at book 3, because you're not going to get from book 4 to book 10. You just put the book down, okay? So I think it's a very important point to understand why Aristotle is talking about those virtues first. That is the method to his madness, as we might say. It's really not so mad at all. It's quite logical. So I am skipping around because I think that Aristotle's view of the soul matches with understanding those. I'm not going to go into particulars regarding those virtues. What I want you to see is the logic. What I want you to see is the general map, as I stated at the introduction to this lecture, so that you can fill in the blanks. Hopefully you'll be, oh, okay. And sometimes when we know why something is there, we'll go on and we'll go through the difficulty of understanding some of the particulars if we're certain that it makes some sense, if we're certain that there will be some payoff, okay? So that's why. Now, the other concepts that Aristotle is at some pains to elaborate on for us are the difference between deliberation, between choice and wish. Deliberation, choice, and wish. And these all, of course, have a special name in Greek, which I don't think I'll require of you, so we'll not bother with that. Some key distinctions to start off with. This is where I can written this over here. Deliberation and choice. I have a big circle written around deliberation and choice, and then an arrow which leads to wish. There's a reason for that. Why? A general map that I'd like for you to understand before we just go over some basic definitions is that deliberation and choice both have to do with means, whereas wish deals with the end. Wish deals with a goal, okay? And Aristotle is he's trying to come up with specific concepts by which we can explain more rigorously and scientifically. Aristotle was a scientist. He believes he's doing science here. He wants to come up with some concepts that more accurately describe or explain what ethical behavior consists of. So, the first we deliberate. Deliberation leads to a choice. Both of these deal with means rather than ends, and wish deals with the end. Hopefully that's clear. And now we'll talk about a few of the particulars so that you'll understand that a little bit better. According to Aristotle, deliberation. We do not deliberate about everything. We only deliberate about what's in our power. Like I'm not going to deliberate whether or not I can jump out of this window and grow wings and fly across campus. I'm not going to deliberate. I might wish about it, but I won't deliberate about it because it's not in my power. It's ridiculous. So we deliberate with the rational part of our soul, our reason, about things that are in our power. Aristotle also mentions that we do not deliberate about the exact and self-contained. We deliberate about what can be otherwise. In other words, and the examples that Aristotle comes up with is that, we don't deliberate about whether or not a law should establish some order and fairness. That should go without saying. We don't, in other words, we don't sit and decide, well, should this law be fair? Nah, no, let's make it unfair. We don't deliberate whether or not a doctor should cure. But of course, it should go without saying. It should be assumed that a doctor is going to cure or heal in some fashion. So we deliberate about things that are truly worth deliberating about. It's like, you know what? I have a choice between 5 schools that I could go to. And that's a serious thing, for a college student. I have these 5 colleges. They all have their positives and their negatives. That's a good thing to deliberate about, because that's something that could be otherwise. You actually have a choice there. And you're using your reason, hopefully, to decide what is going to be the best choice at the end of that deliberation, I'm already indicating to you the meaning of choice. Choice is the end of a deliberation. But you know, do we always deliberate? No, unfortunately, we do not. When we make somebody gets me angry, you know, they insult me, or they even, you know, physically harm me, push me, and I just react. I deck them. I just deck them right in the jaw. Okay, was that a deliberation? Aristotle said, nope, no, wasn't a deliberation at all. A deliberation and a choice, according to Aristotle, must be a rational process. And if it's not, then guess what? It's somewhat involuntary. Our passions decided it. Our appetite decided it. The spirited part of our nature, as Plato would tell us, decided it, rather than a firm, reasonable, logical process by which we deliberated and then came to a choice based on a goal. Like the goal regarding, like, well, okay, I want to be college educated so that I can be successful. Being successful is like, that's sort of the wish. That's the end. That's the goal. Most of us don't deliberately, do I want to be successful in life? No, I want to be a loser. I usually don't hear that. I guess maybe it's been said before, but that would be closer to a wish, the end, the goal, what we're heading towards. And we deliberate about the means to get to that success. And then after we deliberate, we make certain choices so that we can get to the wish, to the end, where I'm headed. Hopefully that has some logic, okay, and makes some sense to you. He does have a few other quid pro quos in there. Choice is basically a voluntary act of reason. It's not involuntary. It has to be, there's some freedom involved there. So it's a voluntary action. Now, we've already talked about what those are. So it makes sense. Aristotle had to write the chapters on involuntary and voluntary action before writing the ones on deliberation, choice, and wish, because you can't understand what he means by choice and deliberation or voluntary acts until you know what he means by a voluntary act. So do you see how he's using building blocks? Like, this is more logical, and you have to understand this, and then you understand this, and then this, and then this. There's a hierarchical nature to Aristotle's construction of the Nicomachean Ethics. So I think those are the most important things. Choice is really making up one's mind after a deliberation. That's probably the easiest way of saying making up one's mind. It's the end result of a deliberation. Because if a deliberation does not result in a choice, some mistake has been made. You know, that you've probably heard this. I mean, sometimes failure to make a choice is itself sometimes a choice. You know, we're in this life is full of trials and suffering. We often just we have to make decisions. We have to. And those decisions are made much better with deliberation and with advice. What would advice be? Advice would be the deliberation of someone else that they share with you. And hopefully that deliberation is good. That's part of what Aristotle thinks that friendship is for. Okay? See, that's where he's going. That's where he's headed. Okay? And what is the ultimate goal? That friends help friends to be virtuous. that's really the ultimate goal of friendship. It all fits together very beautifully in Aristotle. It's a whole vision of life that he's trying to paint for us if we just have the patience and the contemplation to understand it. And I think it's quite a beautiful thing. So those are a few keys about the difference between deliberation, between choice, and between wish. So it's kind of a funny saying. Two frogs sit on a log. One decides to jump in the water. How many frogs are still on the log? I'll say that again. Two frogs sit on a log. One decides to jump in. One makes a choice to jump in. How many frogs left on the log? Lots of people are like, one. No. No. There's still two. One just made a choice. Making a choice is not doing it. Aristotle is supremely practical when it comes to ethical behavior. You could be a genius and you could have an ironclad and perfect deliberation, choice, and wish. And if you don't have the control of yourself, okay, all of this will go awry and you will never arrive at the destination. That's why he talks about it. That's why these concepts fit together. They're, again, I'm trying to illustrate for you that these are not random chapters. They're in there for a reason if we dig a little bit and try to understand what those reasons are. There's just a few other things I would like to mention. Those are most of the key concepts, really. There's a few other things I think that are worth mentioning. He writes on, I didn't put the page number, but there's a fascinating quote in this particular book. He says, "Now every wicked man is in a state of ignorance as to what he ought to do and what he should refrain from doing. And it is due to this kind of error that men and women become unjust and, in general, immoral." I don't know if you heard that, that wickedness, according to really a Socratic, Platonic, and Aristotelian mindset, is due to some grave error in reason. That if we really had the right knowledge, and I'm very much oversimplifying this because there's so many, I'm talking about ultimately the problem of evil, which is a problem that fills libraries with books and many discussions on it. But it's implied here that if we really had the right information, if we really had the right training, we would be virtuous. And there's a dilemma, in other words, that comes up in this chapter is, does Aristotle believe in what we would call true evil? Because he's just saying, you know what, if it seems that if we have the right information, the right training, everyone would go in the right direction. Seems to be what he's saying. But certainly in the Christian tradition, many other religious traditions, and not just that tradition, would maintain that because of this depth of the human spirit that I've already referred to, this freedom that we have, what is true evil? True evil is when perhaps you have the right information, the right knowledge, even the right training, and you still choose to be destructive. You still choose to harm others and the world around you. That's what we would call true evil. I'm kind of ballparking that, but I think that you can see what I mean. There seems to be a question in this chapter, at least this book, whether or not Aristotle believes in true evil. And I think perhaps it would take the Christian tradition to elaborate on this a good deal more. But if you have some comments on that, I'd certainly welcome them. It's a dilemma that I would love to be able to solve. But of course, if I just came up with the ultimate answer to the problem of evil, I would probably be famous and maybe make lots of money, and my abbot would be super, super proud and build buildings named after me, fun stuff like that. So I think that that's worth mentioning. Also worth mentioning, he mentions on page 66 in this translation, the Ostwald translation, only an utterly insensitive person can be ignorant of the fact that moral characteristics are formed by actively engaging in particular actions. In other words, to be a kind person, you have to do kind actions. Only an utterly insensitive person. That I think that, and this of course is an ancient text, there is a group of individuals that now we would call psychopathic and sociopathic, that I think would fall into this category of the utterly insensitive person. I'm not sure about the Greek translation there, but there are individuals who seem to be utterly insensitive of the harm, the pain that they cause their fellow human beings. There have been estimates that as many as perhaps 1 in 25 in at least the first world, North America, have elements of psychopathology or sociopathology, which, and psychology is not my field, although I've studied a good bit of philosophical psychology. It's really the inability to empathize with another human being. That this block that if I, as a human being, know and come to an understanding of what harms me, what breaks my heart, what hurts my feelings, what hurts my body, what hurts my family, okay, then if I am quote unquote normal, if I am a normally formed human person, I should be able to see you as another me, because if I understand what hurts me, then I also understand what hurts you. Does that make sense? And the normal person will refrain. They'll be like, you know what? We live in community, and I know what hurts me. These certain activities are certainly very damaging. And so I'll try not to do that to my brothers and sisters. There might be many ways that we might frame that in our minds, but it goes something like that. Well, there seems to, for the sociopath or the psychopath, some break there between seeing what hurts me and then applying that to you. I just don't apply it to you. And I may utterly destroy your reputation, even take your life, harm your family, steal your goods, and feel no remorse whatsoever. It's truly frightening. It's truly frightening to consider that there could be so many, literally millions of sociopaths and psychopaths in Canada and the United States. And I'm sure you could Google some estimates of this, and it is rather disturbing. But I think, ethically speaking, it's an interesting thing to bring up in relation to this chapter, because we are talking about culpability. We're talking about moral responsibility. We're talking about involuntary action. In other words, if you're a sociopath or a psychopath, how voluntary or involuntary are your actions? I can't answer that for you. Okay. I'm sorry, Chelsea. I can't. There's some people that are watching. It's frustrating because it would really depend on particular circumstances. How culpable is a person for their behavior, especially if they're a true psychopath? I mean, in the very least, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to truly get into someone's mind. In the very least, we have to say, look, this person has proven themselves as being utterly damaging to the community, and the community needs to be protected from them. And so they're put away. The other choice we have is the utter disorder of the community, which results from the destructive behavior of this certain set of individuals. I mean, there's some big ethical questions just right there. But I think that it's something appropriate and interesting to bring up in our present discussion, because Aristotle mentions this utterly insensitive person. I wish I had the chapter there, but I don't right away. Aristotle, he also condemns suicide in this chapter. I think that's something it's at least interesting to bring up, considering the absolute pandemic of depression that we have in North America. There's not just a pandemic of COVID. Some of this attitude really bothers me. And this is an ethical dilemma. Some of the social distancing that we are doing, some of the paranoia that we are causing, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do some distancing. I'm not saying we shouldn't take care of the situation. Of course we should. But I've seen the effect that some of this has had on people with other medical conditions, and certainly those with depression. And are we really helping them? Are we paying attention to them? Or because that can end in death. Last year, I believe that there were approximately, I'm ballparking this, about 60,000 successful, is an awful word to use regarding suicide, but successful suicide, people that actually committed suicide, and about another 250,000 who attempted suicide. Those are the number of deaths in this region that have already we've already had from COVID. In other words, is that not epidemic enough for us to look at it? This is a very thorny ethical issue, because of course we need to protect particularly those individuals in our society that are susceptible to viruses, those that are weak, are elderly, those with special medical problems. But at what cost? The cost of the deaths of these other depressives, at the cost of the destruction of economy, the loss of family and fortune, the shutting down of our churches. It's the consequences of this have been massive, and there are some very interesting ethical issues. That's the reason why I bring it up. That I think that we could relate some of the concepts that we've learned, certainly in book 3, to some of the behavior that we're experiencing right now. But regarding suicide, Aristotle believes it's condemnable. And one of the reasons why I bring it up is a lot of times people will say, oh, well, the condemnation of suicide is just a religious thing. But there, God said, you shall not kill, and, we're supposed to belong to God if in fact he exists. This is a philosophy class, right? Not a theology class. And so you shouldn't go destroying his property willy-nilly, his property, which you are, right? That's a religious argument, and I don't accept it, so it's fine for me to kill myself. Well, Aristotle has nothing to do with Christianity, but he still condemns it. And what he says, this is on page 72 of the Ostwald translation that we're using, to seek death as an escape from poverty, love, or some other painful experience. It's interesting that he would mention love as a painful experience. Sometimes love can get us. To seek escape from these things is to be a coward rather than a person of courage. For to run from troubles is softness, and such a one does not endure death because it is noble, but because he is fleeing from evil. He just considers it really sheer cowardice. And that might be overstating things, because even I've experienced a certain level of depression. Depression is a disease, and we often do not see a way out. And so in many cases, the culpability for a suicide is just not there. Like, how voluntary or involuntary was that action? Did you experience so much pain? Because often this is the case. And this is arguable. I'm just using the terms that we've already learned. That those were external forces pushing you to act in a certain way. Or maybe it's ignorance. Remember, involuntary action is due to ignorance. But your mind, your soul had become so darkened that you simply cannot see a way out. That is a form of ignorance, is it not? That's why it's so important, if you're experiencing that level of melancholy, that level of depression, to connect with other people so that you can benefit from the fact that, well, maybe they can see a way out. They see hope for you, whereas maybe you can't see it for yourself. And I just think it's a thing worth mentioning. But I do think there is this mystery of the human person that, despite the level of pain, we could choose to rise above it. There's this depth within us where we can just face it down and say, no, I'm not going to succumb to these terrible external circumstances that are pressing me into the ground. And these also have to do with, our abilities to control that irrational part of our nature. This ability to deal with pain, okay, our courage. Really not so much dealing with pleasure. We could say it deals with pleasure insofar as whenever you're depressed, it's very difficult to experience pleasure, right? But I think that Aristotle brings up a few things like that, I think, because he's still trying to teach us something about the difference between involuntary and voluntary actions, things that can cripple our ability to deliberate, to choose, and to decide on the correct end, the right direction, the final destination, the wish to go. And if ultimately, and this is where I'll end, if ultimately we cannot control our irrational nature, if we cannot be temperate human beings, which we'll read about later, then it's simply academic to look at the rest of the book. the ultimate test of ethics is not just in the knowing, but also in the doing. And Aristotle is quite clear about that. The truly wise man, the truly wise woman, not only understands the correct thing to do, but also carries it out. And that's where I will end. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.